Captain Sarah Martinez had always trusted her team completely. After 15 years in military special operations, she believed that trust was everything. Her unit was like family, and family never betrayed each other. But as she stood in the equipment room that cold morning in Afghanistan, checking her parachute gear one final time, she had no idea that someone she trusted with her life was about to take it away. The mission briefed earlier that day seemed straightforward. Intelligence had located a high-value target in a remote mountain compound. Sarah would lead a 4-person team in a nighttime halo jump, landing behind enemy lines to gather crucial information. The plan was simple: get in, collect intel, and extract before dawn. She had done similar missions dozens of times before. Sergeant Rick Coleman, her equipment specialist for the past 3 years, handed her the main parachute with his usual confident smile. "Everything's perfect, Captain. Checked it twice myself," he said, his voice steady as always. Sarah nodded, grateful for his attention to detail. Rick had never let her down before, and his expertise had saved their lives on multiple occasions. What Sarah didn't know was that Rick had received a message 3 days earlier. His younger brother had been captured by enemy forces, and the only way to save him was to ensure Captain Martinez never made it to the target alive. The enemy had done their homework well. They knew Rick's weakness and exploited it perfectly. The transport plane climbed to altitude. Sarah reviewed the mission parameters with her team. The target compound sat on a rocky plateau surrounded by steep cliffs and dense forest. The insertion point was carefully chosen to provide maximum cover while maintaining a clear path to their objective. Weather conditions were ideal, with minimal wind and good visibility. Lieutenant James Parker, the team's communications specialist, expressed some concerns about the extraction plan. "Captain, the pickup zone is pretty tight. If we're running hot, it might be difficult to reach in time." Sarah appreciated his thoroughness but felt confident in their training and preparation. They had practiced similar scenarios countless times. Corporal Maria Santos and Private First Class David Chen, the team's reconnaissance and demolitions experts respectively, were already preparing their equipment. Both were relatively new to Sarah's unit but had proven themselves capable and reliable. Sarah felt good about the team composition and their chances of success. As they approached the jump zone, Sarah performed her final equipment check. Everything appeared normal. Her altimeter was functioning properly, her radio was clear, and her weapon was secure. The jump master gave the 10-minute warning and the team began their final preparations. Rick watched Sarah with growing anxiety. He had tried to convince himself that there might be another way, but time was running out. His brother's captors had been clear about the consequences of failure. As much as he respected and cared for Sarah, family came first. He had made his choice days ago, and now he had to live with it. The red light came on, signaling 5 minutes to jump. Sarah moved to the door with her team close behind. The wind rushing past the aircraft was deafening, but she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before every mission. This was what she lived for: the precise execution of complex operations under extreme pressure. At 30,000 feet, the night sky was crystal clear. Stars stretched endlessly in all directions, and the mountains below were barely visible shadows against the dark landscape. Sarah took a deep breath of the thin air and focused on the mission ahead. In less than an hour, they would be on the ground deep in enemy territory. The jump master held up one finger, 1 minute remaining. Sarah checked her team one final time. Everyone looked ready and focused. Parker gave her a thumbs up, followed by Santos and Chen. These were professional soldiers at their best, prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. Rick stood near the rear of the aircraft, ostensibly monitoring the jump sequence but actually watching Sarah with a mixture of admiration and guilt. She was everything a military leader should be: brave, intelligent, and completely dedicated to her team. What he had done would haunt him forever, but his brother's life hung in the balance. The light turned green. "Go, go, go!" shouted the jump master. Sarah stepped into the void without hesitation, followed immediately by her team. as they fell through the darkness toward the enemy-controlled mountains below. None of them suspected that Sarah's parachute had been carefully sabotaged, to fail at the worst possible moment. The first few seconds of freefall were perfect. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of floating through space as she monitored her altimeter and maintained formation with her team. The target zone was clearly visible now, a small clearing surrounded by rugged terrain that would provide excellent concealment once they were on the ground. At 15,000 feet, Sarah signaled her team to prepare for deployment. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. The weather remained favorable, their formation was tight, and the landing zone looked clear of obstacles. In just a few more minutes, they would be beginning the most dangerous phase of their mission. At 10,000 feet, Sarah pulled her ripcord with practiced precision. She expected to feel the familiar jerk as her parachute deployed, slowing her descent to a manageable speed. Instead, she felt nothing. The main chute had partially deployed, but was twisted and tangled, providing almost no resistance to her fall. Panic tried to grip her mind, but Sarah's training took over immediately. She had less than 60 seconds to solve this problem before hitting the ground at terminal velocity. Her hands moved to the cutaway handle, releasing the damaged main chute, and then immediately pulled the reserve parachute ripcord. The reserve chute deployed normally, but Sarah realized she was still falling much faster than planned and was now far off course from the intended landing zone. Below her, she could see her team members' parachutes deployed successfully, their white canopies clearly visible against the dark mountainside. They would land in the designated area as planned, but she would be alone in unknown territory. "Lieutenant," Parker's voice crackled through her radio headset. "Captain, we see you're off course. What's your status?" Sarah quickly assessed her situation while fighting to control her descent. She was heading toward a steep, rocky slope covered with dense forest. Not an ideal landing spot for someone moving at this speed. "Main chute failure. Reserve deployed, but I'm coming in hot and way off target," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She could see the ground rushing up fast now, and her options were limited. Parker immediately began coordinating with the rest of the team. "Santos, Chen, mark your position when you land. We need to reach the captain's location as soon as possible." Both soldiers acknowledged the order while preparing for their own landings in the designated zone. Sarah aimed for the thickest part of the forest, hoping the tree canopy would help slow her descent. At this speed, even a controlled landing would result in serious injuries, but it was her best chance of survival. She pulled her knees up and prepared for impact, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether she lived or died. The first branches tore at her equipment and uniform as she crashed through the forest canopy. Small branches snapped like gunshots around her, and larger ones threatened to catch her parachute lines and send her spinning out of control. Sarah fought to maintain some semblance of a landing position as she plummeted through the darkness. She hit the ground hard, rolling and bouncing down a steep slope covered with loose rocks and fallen logs. Pain shot through her left ankle and shoulder as she tumbled uncontrollably for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she came to rest against a large boulder, her parachute tangled in the trees above. For several minutes, Sarah lay still, taking inventory of her injuries and trying to get her bearings. Her ankle was definitely sprained or worse, her shoulder felt dislocated, and she had numerous cuts and bruises from the impact and subsequent tumble down the mountainside. But she was alive, conscious, and still armed. Her radio had been damaged, in the landing producing only static when she tried to contact her team. Sarah realized she was completely on her own in enemy territory, injured, and with no way to communicate her position. The mission had gone from routine to desperate in a matter of minutes. Using her uninjured arm, Sarah carefully extracted herself from the parachute harness and gathered her remaining equipment. Her rifle had survived the impact, and she still had her sidearm, ammunition, and basic survival gear. Most importantly, she retained the mission-critical communication device needed to gather intelligence from the target compound. As Sarah attempted to stand, the severity of her ankle injury became clear. She could put minimal weight on it without excruciating pain. Moving through this terrain would be slow and dangerous, especially in the dark. But staying in one place wasn't an option. Enemy patrols would likely investigate the crash site. Once daylight came, she pulled out her map and GPS device, both thankfully undamaged. Her current position was approximately 2 miles from the target compound, but the terrain between her location and the objective was some of the most difficult in the region. Steep cliffs, dense forest, and known enemy patrol routes made direct movement nearly impossible. Looking up at the cliff face rising above her, Sarah noticed something interesting. A series of natural ledges and rock formations created what appeared to be a challenging but possible climbing route directly up the mountainside. If she could reach the top, she would be in perfect position to approach the target compound from an unexpected direction. The climb would be extremely difficult with her injuries, and attempting it in darkness bordered on suicidal. But Sarah realized it might be her only chance to complete the mission and reunite with her team. The enemy would expect infiltrators to approach from the valley floor, not from the supposedly impassable cliff face directly above their position. She began, moving carefully through the forest toward the base of the cliff, using her rifle as a makeshift crutch to take weight off her injured ankle. Every step was painful, but Sarah forced herself to maintain a steady pace. Time was critical now. She needed to reach the compound before dawn if she had any hope of success. As she picked her way through the darkness, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her parachute failure had been too convenient, too perfectly timed to be accidental. Someone had wanted her dead or at least separated from her team. The question was who and why. But those answers would have to wait. Right now, survival and mission completion were her only priorities. The base of the cliff loomed above her like a massive wall of stone and shadow. Sarah examined the rock face with her night vision equipment, plotting a route that would take her to the top while remaining concealed from any enemy observers below. It would be the most dangerous climb of her life, but failure wasn't an option. The cliff face stretched nearly 200 feet straight up into the darkness. Sarah secured her equipment and began the treacherous ascent, relying on her injured left arm and one good leg to pull herself up the rocky surface. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but she gritted her teeth and continued climbing. The rock was loose in many places, forcing Sarah to test each handhold carefully before trusting it with her full weight. Several times, chunks of stone broke away and tumbled down into the forest below, the sound echoing off the mountainside like gunshots. She held her breath each time, waiting to see if the noise had attracted unwanted attention. About halfway up the cliff, Sarah's strength began to fail. Her injured shoulder screamed in protest with every movement, and her grip was becoming increasingly unreliable. She found a narrow ledge just wide enough to rest on and took a few minutes to assess her situation. The smart thing would be to turn back and find another route, but time was running out. Below in the valley, she could see lights moving through the forest, enemy search teams looking for whoever had crashed through their territory. They were organized and methodical, using dogs and thermal imaging equipment to track any intruders. Sarah realized that going back down would mean certain capture or death. She resumed climbing with renewed determination. The upper section of the cliff was actually more challenging than the bottom. With fewer handholds and more exposure to the wind, Sarah's injured ankle kept bumping against the rock face, causing excruciating pain that threatened to make her lose concentration at crucial moments. Near the top of the cliff, Sarah encountered an overhang that seemed impossible to navigate. With her injuries, the rock curved outward for about 10 feet, requiring climbers to hang upside down while working their way around to the final section. Under normal circumstances, it would have been difficult, but manageable. With a dislocated shoulder and sprained ankle, it appeared insurmountable. But Sarah noticed that someone had climbed this route before. Old pitons and rope anchors were embedded in the rock, probably left by previous military reconnaissance teams or local climbers. The equipment looked solid enough to support her weight, giving her a chance to bypass the most difficult section of the overhang. Using the fixed anchors and her own rope, Sarah slowly worked her way around the overhang. Several times she nearly lost her grip, dangling by one hand while her feet searched desperately for purchase on the smooth rock face. The pain in her shoulder was almost unbearable, but she forced herself to keep moving upward. Finally, After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, Sarah pulled herself over the edge of the cliff onto a narrow plateau covered with scrub brush and loose rocks. She lay motionless for several minutes, catching her breath and letting the pain subside to manageable levels. The hardest part was over, but the mission was just beginning. From her new vantage point, Sarah could see the target compound clearly. It was exactly as described in the intelligence briefings, a collection of concrete buildings surrounded by high walls and guard towers. Floodlights swept the perimeter regularly, and she could see sentries moving along the walls. The facility looked heavily defended and extremely well organized. What the intelligence reports hadn't mentioned was the sophisticated communication array visible on the main building's roof. This wasn't just a safe house or training facility. It was clearly a major command and control center for enemy operations in the region. The intelligence value of this target had just increased dramatically. Sarah checked her equipment and found that the mission-critical communication device had been damaged during her rough landing and subsequent climb. The device could still function, but its range was severely limited. She would need to get much closer to the compound to successfully intercept the communications traffic they were after. Looking down at the compound from above, Sarah began to formulate a new plan. The enemy had obviously prepared for attacks from the valley and surrounding approaches, but their defensive positions were oriented outward. They had left the cliffside relatively undefended, probably assuming it was impassable. A series of maintenance buildings and storage facilities were built right against the cliff face, their roofs only about 30 feet below Sarah's current position. If she could rappel down to those buildings, she might be able to access the main compound through a service entrance or maintenance tunnel. Sarah examined her rappelling equipment, checking that it had survived the parachute malfunction and subsequent climb. The rope was intact and her harness was still functional despite the abuse it had taken. She had enough equipment to make the descent, but once she went down, there would be no way back up without assistance. The risk was enormous. If she was discovered on the compound grounds, she would be completely trapped with no escape route. But the intelligence gathering opportunity was too valuable to pass up, especially considering what her team had already sacrificed to get this far. As Sarah prepared for the descent, she noticed movement in the forest below. Her team was making their way up the mountainside, following what appeared to be a well-used trail that switchbacked through the dense forest. They were moving carefully and professionally, but they were also heading directly into a heavily patrolled area. Through her scope, Sarah could see enemy positions that her team couldn't possibly know about from their current location. There were at least 2 concealed machine gun nests and a mortar position that commanded excellent fields of fire over the approach route. Her team was walking into an ambush. Sarah tried desperately to contact Parker through her damaged radio, but could only produce weak static. She was too far away to signal them visually, and any noise she made might alert the enemy to her position on the cliff. Her team was in mortal danger, and there was nothing she could do to warn them from her current position. She had to make an impossible choice: attempt to warn her team and risk compromising her own position and the mission, or continue with the intelligence gathering operation, while her soldiers walked unknowingly toward a carefully prepared killing zone. Every instinct told her to protect her team, but the intelligence they were after could save hundreds of other lives. Sarah made her decision in seconds. She couldn't save her team from this position, but she could complete the mission and potentially create a distraction that might help them survive. She secured her rappelling line to a solid anchor point and began her descent toward the compound buildings below. The drop was more difficult than anticipated. The cliff face was not perfectly vertical, requiring Sarah to push off repeatedly to avoid obstacles and maintain control of her descent. Her injured shoulder made it nearly impossible to manage the rope properly, and she had to rely mostly on her right arm to control her speed. Halfway down, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire echoing from the forest. The ambush had been triggered. Her heart raced as she imagined what her team was facing, but she forced herself to focus on the mission. Getting captured or killed now wouldn't help anyone. She landed hard on the roof of a maintenance building, the impact sending fresh waves of pain through her injured ankle. Sarah quickly gathered her rappelling gear and moved to the edge of the roof to assess the compound layout from this new perspective. The intelligence reports had been accurate about the basic structure, but there were details that could only be seen from inside the perimeter. The main building was definitely the command center, with multiple communication antennas and what appeared to be a sophisticated electronic warfare setup. Guard patrols moved in predictable patterns around the compound, but they were alert and well-armed. Sarah counted at least 20 enemy fighters visible from her position, with probably twice that number inside the buildings. She noticed that the maintenance building she had landed on was connected to the main structure by a covered walkway. The walkway appeared to be used primarily for utility access, with power cables and communication lines running along its length. It might provide a concealed route into the main building. Sarah carefully lowered herself from the roof using a drain pipe, landing in a small courtyard surrounded by storage buildings. The area was dimly lit and appeared to be unguarded, but she could hear voices and activity from the main compound just beyond the wall. Moving silently through the shadows, Sarah reached the entrance to the covered walkway. The door was locked, but her lock-picking skills made quick work of the simple mechanism. Inside, the walkway was dark and cluttered with pipes and electrical equipment, providing excellent concealment. As she moved through the walkway toward the main building, Sarah could hear radio communications coming from speakers mounted along the walls. The enemy was coordinating their response to the firefight in the forest, and from what she could understand, her team was holding their own, but was seriously outnumbered. The walkway ended at a service entrance to the main building. Sarah paused. Here, knowing that once she entered the building itself, the risk of detection would increase dramatically. But her damaged communication device needed to be much closer to the enemy's equipment to function effectively. She picked the lock on the service entrance and found herself in a basement filled with generators, water pumps, and other mechanical equipment. The noise from the machinery would help mask any sounds she made, but it also meant she might not hear approaching guards until it was too late. A stairway led up to the main floor of the building. Sarah climbed carefully, her injured ankle making each step a challenge. At the top of the stairs, she found herself in a corridor lined with offices and communication rooms. This was exactly what she had been looking for. Through an open doorway, Sarah could see the main communication center. Banks of radio equipment, computer terminals, and monitoring devices filled a large room where several enemy operators worked, frantically to coordinate their forces. The intelligence value of what she was seeing was enormous. Sarah activated her damaged communication device and was relieved to find that it was functioning at this close range. She began recording communication, signals, and downloading data from the enemy's electronic systems. The information she was gathering would provide invaluable intelligence about enemy operations throughout the region. While her equipment worked, Sarah listened to the enemy communications about the ongoing firefight. Her team had managed to reach a defensive position and was calling for extraction, but enemy reinforcements were moving to surround them. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Suddenly, Sarah heard footsteps approaching in the corridor outside. She quickly moved deeper into the communication center, hiding behind a bank of equipment while her device continued its work. 2 enemy soldiers entered the room and began checking the equipment, apparently looking for signs of intrusion. One of the soldiers stopped directly in front of Sarah's hiding place and began examining a control panel just inches from her position. She held her breath and remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement would give her away. The soldier seemed suspicious, but couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. After what felt like an eternity, the soldiers moved on to check other areas of the building. Sarah's communication device indicated that it had successfully copied most of the available data, but she needed a few more minutes to complete the download. She decided to risk staying in position to finish the mission. The sound of gunfire from the forest was getting closer, indicating that the battle was moving toward the compound. Sarah realized that her team might be fighting their way toward her position, or they might be retreating under heavy pressure. Either way, she needed to finish her work and prepare for whatever came next. Her device finally completed its data collection. Sarah had successfully gathered detailed intelligence about enemy communication networks, command structures, and operational plans. The information would be invaluable to military planners, but she still needed to survive long enough to deliver As she prepared to leave the communication center, Sarah heard a commotion in the compound courtyard. Looking through a window, she saw enemy reinforcements preparing to move out toward the forest battle. This was her chance to escape the building while most of the guards were focused elsewhere. But as she reached the corridor, Sarah came face to face with an enemy soldier who had been left behind to guard the communication center. Both of them froze for a split second, equally surprised by the encounter. Sarah knew that her survival and the success of the entire mission now depended on what happened in the next few seconds. Sarah reacted first, using her good leg to kick the enemy soldier in the knee while simultaneously grabbing for his weapon. The guard stumbled backward, crying out in pain and surprise. Sarah knew she had only seconds before his shouts brought reinforcements running. The soldier was young but well-trained, recovering quickly from her initial attack and swinging his rifle toward her. Sarah ducked under the weapon and used her momentum to tackle him around the waist, driving both of them to the floor in a tangle of arms and legs. Fighting with her injuries made every movement difficult and painful, but Sarah's desperation gave her strength. She managed to get her hands on the soldier's rifle and used it to pin his arms while she reached for her sidearm. The guard fought back fiercely, trying to break free and call for help. Sarah finally managed to draw her pistol and struck the guard across the temple with the butt. He went limp immediately, unconscious but still breathing. She quickly checked that he hadn't managed to trigger any alarms, then dragged his unconscious body into a nearby storage closet. The sounds of fighting from the forest were getting much closer now, and Sarah could hear vehicle engines starting up in the compound courtyard. The enemy was mobilizing their reserve forces to deal with the threat, which meant fewer guards in the building but also meant time was running out. Sarah made her way back toward the service entrance, moving as quickly as her injuries would allow. The basement was still empty, but she could hear activity on the floors above as the enemy prepared their response. She needed to get out of the building before someone discovered the unconscious guard. As she reached the covered walkway, Sarah heard her radio crackle with weak static. Someone was trying to communicate on her team's frequency, but the signal was too weak and distorted to understand. She adjusted the radio settings and tried to boost the signal strength. Lieutenant Parker's voice came through clearly for just a moment. Surrounded. Need immediate extraction. Coordinates. Then the signal faded back into static. Sarah realized her team was in desperate trouble and running out of options. They needed help, and she might be their only chance. Sarah reached the maintenance building where she had first landed and climbed back onto the roof. From this elevated position, she could see muzzle flashes in the forest where her team was, fighting for their lives. The enemy had deployed at least 50 fighters and was systematically closing in on her soldiers' position. Using her rifle scope, Sarah could make out individual targets among the enemy forces. She was too far away for accurate shooting with a standard rifle, but she noticed something that might help. The enemy had positioned a mortar team on a ridge overlooking the battle, and their ammunition was stored in clearly marked boxes. Sarah took careful aim at the ammunition pile and fired a single shot. The round struck one of the mortar shells, triggering a massive explosion that lit up the night sky. The blast took out the entire mortar position and created enough chaos to give her team a brief respite. The explosion also had an unintended consequence. It revealed Sarah's position to enemy forces in the compound. Searchlights immediately swung toward the maintenance buildings, and she could hear shouts and running footsteps as guards moved to investigate. Sarah knew she had only minutes before the building would be surrounded. She gathered her equipment and looked for another escape route. The cliff face she had climbed earlier was too steep and exposed to climb back up, especially with enemy forces watching. She needed another option. Looking down into the compound courtyard, Sarah noticed that most of the vehicles had already departed to reinforce the forest battle. Only a few guards remained, and they were focused on searching the buildings rather than watching the motor pool. One truck remained, a supply vehicle that had been loaded but not yet deployed. Sarah made a desperate decision. She would have to fight her way to that truck and use it to reach her team's position. It was an incredibly risky plan, but staying in the compound meant certain capture or death, and her team needed immediate assistance. She climbed down from the roof and moved through the shadows toward the compound's main area. The guards were searching systematically but had not yet organized a coordinated sweep. Sarah used this confusion to her advantage, staying ahead of the search teams while working her way toward the motor pool. The truck was parked near the compound's main gate, about 50 yards from her current position. Between Sarah and the vehicle were 2 guards and an open courtyard with very little cover. She would have to move fast and hope that surprise would carry her through. Sarah checked her weapons one final time. She had her rifle, sidearm, and several grenades. The truck appeared to be fueled and ready to go. She just needed to reach it without getting killed in the process. Taking a deep breath, she prepared to make her move. Just as Sarah was about to leave her concealment, the compound's main gate opened and a convoy of enemy vehicles returned from the forest battle. She could see wounded fighters and damaged equipment, indicating that her team was giving a good account of themselves despite being outnumbered. But the return of these forces also meant that the compound was now fully manned again, making her escape much more difficult. Sarah realized she might only get one chance at this, and failure would mean not only her own death, but also the loss of the vital intelligence she had gathered. The lead vehicle in the returning convoy was badly damaged and smoking. As it limped through the gate, the engine finally gave out, and the truck rolled to a stop directly between Sarah and her target vehicle. The distraction of dealing with the breakdown gave her the opening she had been waiting for. Sarah sprinted from her hiding place toward the supply truck, using the confusion around the broken-down vehicle to mask her movement. She was halfway across the courtyard before anyone noticed her, and by then it was too late for them to react effectively. Sarah reached the supply truck just as the first enemy soldiers spotted her movement across the courtyard. Bullets began striking the ground around her feet as she dove into the driver's seat and fumbled for the ignition. The engine turned over, immediately where her luck was finally changing. She gunned the accelerator and crashed through the compound's main gate, wood and metal flying in all directions. The truck's heavy construction allowed it to smash through obstacles that would have stopped a lighter vehicle, but the impact sent sharp pains through her injured shoulder and ankle. Enemy fighters scattered as the truck roared through their positions, some diving for cover while others tried to bring their weapons to bear on the speeding vehicle. Sarah kept her head low as bullets shattered the windshield and punched holes through the truck's metal sides. Once clear of the immediate compound area, Sarah had to navigate the narrow mountain road in darkness while under fire from enemy positions along the route. The truck's headlights made her an easy target, but driving without them on this treacherous terrain would be suicidal. Her radio crackled to life with Parker's voice. "Unknown vehicle approaching from the south. Identify yourself immediately, or we will engage." Sarah grabbed the microphone while steering around a sharp curve with one hand. "Parker, this is Martinez. I'm in the stolen truck heading your way. What's your status?" The relief in her voice was obvious even over the static-filled transmission. "Captain, we thought you were dead. We're pinned down about half a mile north of the compound. Enemy has us surrounded, but we're holding a good defensive position. Can you reach us?" Sarah checked her position on the GPS and realized she was only a few minutes away from her team's location. But the enemy had set up roadblocks along the obvious routes, forcing her to take a more difficult path through the forest. She turned off the main road onto a logging trail that headed in the right direction. The truck bounced and lurched over the rough terrain, but its sturdy construction allowed it to handle conditions that would have disabled most vehicles. Sarah's injuries made the wild ride extremely painful, but she gritted her teeth and kept driving. Through the trees ahead, Sarah could see the muzzle flashes from her team's defensive position. They had found good cover among some large boulders and fallen logs, but enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions. Sarah realized she needed to act quickly before her soldiers were overwhelmed. She aimed the truck directly at the largest concentration of enemy fighters and floored the accelerator. The vehicle crashed through underbrush and small trees, scattering enemy soldiers who dove desperately to avoid being run down. Sarah used the truck's mass and momentum as a weapon, disrupting the enemy's coordinated attack. As the truck finally came to a stop after clipping a large tree, Sarah bailed out and ran toward her team's position. Parker, Santos, and Chen were all alive but wounded and low on ammunition. They had been fighting continuously for over 2 hours against overwhelming odds. "Captain, where the hell have you been?" Parker asked with a grin despite their desperate situation. Sarah quickly briefed her team on what had happened and showed them the intelligence data she had gathered. "This information is worth more than all our lives combined," she explained. "We need to get it back to headquarters immediately." But first they had to survive the next few minutes as enemy forces regrouped for another assault. Sarah distributed ammunition from the truck's cargo area and helped establish better defensive positions. Her team's morale improved dramatically with her return. They had feared she was dead and had been preparing for a last stand. The enemy's next attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, but Sarah's tactical experience helped coordinate her team's response. They concentrated their fire on the most dangerous threats, while using the truck as mobile cover to reposition when necessary. During a brief lull in the fighting, Sarah's radio picked up a transmission on the extraction frequency. Their helicopter was inbound but couldn't land in the current battle zone. They needed to break contact and move to an alternate pickup point about a mile away. Sarah made the decision to use the truck to break through the enemy encirclement. It was damaged but still functional, and its armor plating provided some protection against small arms fire. Her team loaded their equipment and wounded comrades into the vehicle. The breakout was violent and desperate. Sarah drove straight through the enemy's positions while her team provided covering fire from the truck bed. Several enemy fighters were too close to avoid, and the truck's front bumper became a weapon of necessity. They reached the extraction zone just as their helicopter appeared on the horizon. The pilot had been monitoring their radio traffic and was ready for a hot extraction under fire. Sarah's team provided security while the aircraft landed in a small clearing, barely large enough for the rotors. As they lifted off, Sarah looked back at the compound burning in the distance. The intelligence mission had been successful, but the cost had been enormous. Her trust in her own equipment specialist had been shattered, and she knew that Rick Coleman would face serious consequences when the truth about the sabotaged parachute came to light. The helicopter carried them toward safety, but Sarah's mind was already working on the implications of what she had discovered. The enemy's communication network was more sophisticated than anyone had realized, and the intelligence she had gathered would require immediate analysis by the highest levels of command. 3 days later, Sarah learned that Rick Coleman had confessed to sabotaging her parachute. His brother had been rescued in a separate operation, but Rick faced court-martial for endangering his commanding officer and compromising a critical mission. The enemy had exploited his personal weakness perfectly, turning a trusted soldier into an unwilling saboteur. Sarah testified at Rick's court-martial, and despite her anger and sense of betrayal, she spoke about the impossible choice he had faced between his military duty and his family loyalty. The court sentenced Rick to military prison, but Sarah's testimony helped ensure he received counseling and support rather than the harshest possible punishment. The intelligence Sarah had gathered during her solo infiltration proved to be invaluable. The enemy communication network she had penetrated led to the disruption of terrorist operations across 3 countries and potentially saved hundreds of civilian lives. Her superiors recommended her for the Medal of Honor, citing her extraordinary courage and tactical brilliance under impossible circumstances. But for Sarah, the real victory was simpler. Her team had survived, the mission was complete, and she had proven that even when everything went wrong, determination and improvisation could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The betrayal had shaken her faith in absolute trust, but it had also shown her the true strength that comes from relying on oneself when all other options fail. Lieutenant Parker was promoted and given command of his own unit. Corporal Santos and Private Chen both received commendations for their performance during the mission, and all 3 credited Sarah's leadership with their survival. The team remained close, bonded by their shared experience of that terrible night in the mountains. Sarah returned to duty after recovering from her injuries, but she never forgot the lessons learned during those desperate hours. Trust remained important, but self-reliance was essential. She began training other special operations soldiers in advanced survival and improvisation techniques, ensuring that future generations would be prepared for the unexpected betrayals and equipment failures that could turn routine missions into life-or-death struggles. The compound they had infiltrated was abandoned within days of the mission, its communication network dismantled and its operational value destroyed. Intelligence analysts estimated that the information Sarah had gathered set back enemy operations by at least 2 years and prevented numerous planned attacks on military and civilian targets. Years later, when young soldiers asked Sarah about the most important lesson from her military career, she would tell them about the night her parachute failed and how she learned that sometimes the most direct path to success leads straight through the enemy's front door. She would remind them that when technology fails, when teammates betray you, and when everything goes wrong, the mission can still succeed if you refuse to give up and think creatively about alternative solutions. Sarah Martinez retired from active duty with the rank of colonel. Her reputation as one of the military's most innovative tactical thinkers firmly established, but she never forgot Rick Coleman or the complex moral choices that war forces on ordinary people. She established a foundation to support military families facing crisis situations, believing that preventing such desperate choices was better than punishing them after the fact. The mission reports from that night became required reading at military academies, not just for the tactical lessons, but for the ethical discussions they generated about loyalty, duty, and the difficult decisions soldiers must sometimes make when personal and professional obligations conflict.